Good morning, listeners. I'm Christian.
And I am Micah, and welcome to the Morning Ponderings podcast.
Far too often, we humans tend to reject the reality of many possibilities, opting or being pressured into choosing one possibility while rejecting all others.
This can often lead us to be afraid of asking questions and easily fall into falsehoods and lies and the fear of being wrong.
On this show, we aim to explore the possibilities of life's greatest mysteries so that empathy for other viewpoints can flourish. All right, well, good morning, Micah.
Good morning, Christian. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It was a little bit of a stressful morning to start. My wife is going to the zoo with our son today in celebration of his cousin's birthday.
Fun.
And there was just a number of things. Well, what can go wrong will go wrong. That went wrong this morning. So, but everything worked out and they're heading out shortly. So yeah, what about you? How was your morning?
Pretty good, pretty quiet. It's a early morning for me. So just got up and got ready as quick as I could.
Yeah, it's even earlier for you than it is for me.
Indeed. Yeah, should we say where we're from?
Yeah,
Where we're
what brings
based
us
at?
to this podcast of morning ponderings? So, Micah, what brings you here apart from me asking you to be here?
Right, yeah. So we connected on TikTok, where we are both content creators, and I am based in Kansas City, Missouri. So that's my home base right now. But you know, the beauty of the internet is that you can connect with people from anywhere.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Christian, where are you at?
I am in the middle of the cornfields of Indiana in a small town called Marion. And yeah, it's nice. The temperature can tend to fluctuate, and it's been really hot lately, which hasn't been great because my wife and I's AC has been out. So we just went out and used a credit card because we just absolutely had to get a window AC unit, and that has helped tremendously. But more or less, yep, that's where I'm at.
Nice. Yeah, I can't imagine being in Missouri where it's just 100% humidity. It seems like all the time. Can't imagine not having AC.
Yeah, you know something that's weird? There was all the talk for a while about like cicadas coming in force. We never really got that here. And I don't know if they're like still yet to come or what, but did you get that at all?
You know, I remember hearing that, and I haven't heard any either, which is weird because we would be a cicada breeding ground. So
yeah, right.
I'll have to do some research, see what happened to them.
Right? Did they all go extinct all of a sudden? Who knows?
They're afraid of the pandemic or something. I don't know.
Social distancing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the reasons why I reached out to you is you and I are both part of the same sphere of, not only are we both TikTok creators, but we both kind of are in that deconstructing Christians genre, I guess. But somewhat not really-ish. We tend to diversify a little bit, but that's kind of mostly where we're at, would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I watched a number of your videos and found myself relating to them a lot in terms of content. Like maybe our stories differ quite a bit, but when it comes to the same sort of conclusions we were arriving at, the same sort of thoughts we were having, I was like, wow, I would really love to just sit down and pick his brain for a little while, and maybe for the entire duration of several episodes in a series on a podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so I reached out to you and I was like, hey, Micah, I don't know about you, but I've always kind of had this desire to do a podcast or some kind of a talk show of some variety, and I can relate to you quite a bit. I'd love to talk to you more about life and the mysteries of the universe. So what do you think about joining me on a podcast? And you said?
I said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And I had seen quite a few of your videos as well, and saw just how well you dive into things really intellectually. And I consider myself an intellectual, but I don't dive things like I'm very much more practical, I guess, in my approach. but I was like, I think we'll really balance each other out in the ways that we kind of go at topics. Even though we come from kind of that similar space, we're going to view things in such a different way and tackle things in a different way. And that's going to, I think, provide for some interesting conversation that could really help people think about some of the difficult topics to think about. So yeah, I was excited, and I thought this was a great idea.
Yeah. And just so our listeners can have an idea of the sort of journey that's brought you and I together, would you mind telling us a little bit about a brief version of your faith journey / deconstruction journey up to this point?
Sure. Yeah.
If you would even call it a deconstruction, would you? Like some people are veering away from that term.
I think I would still call it that. I think it still speaks to my journey. So I grew up in the Christian world. My parents were both Christians, and I did the whole church thing my entire life.
Was there any particular denomination?
I was actually a part of quite a few different denominations, but mostly non-denominational. There wasn't really, I guess, they weren't tied to something, but they obviously came from different beliefs. So I was so much so a part of that I eventually was like, I want to become a worship leader. So since college, really since high school, that's what I wanted to do. And I went to college for that and studied worship ministry. And then as soon as I got out of college, started working at a church, and through that started asking a lot of questions. And as I started to ask more and more questions and dive deeper and deeper into those questions and change my perspectives, I realized I was growing. Really, the best way to describe it, I was growing out of the faith that I was in. I was growing out of the church that I was in.
So prior to your experience, like asking questions, that's a very big hurdle that a lot of people, including myself, like have to get over. What was your relationship or your outlook on asking questions prior to really embracing it?
Terrified. Hated them. Hated questions. I was actually one of the people who discouraged questions, not like verbally, but in the sense of like, I thought it was best to not have questions or not have doubts, and that actually equaled stronger faith. And so I often would bow out of conversations where there would be hard questions or things that I didn't want to think about, because I thought it was better to not dive into those, because I just had childlike faith, right?
Yeah.
But I eventually learned that asking questions actually made my faith go a lot deeper and be a lot more sure, even if I didn't come at the same angle or have the same conclusion after I had asked those questions. So I started off not a good relationship with questions, but then later on that kind of led me really to where I am.
So was there like a really flip of the switch moment for you that like really made you realize either, it's weird that I'm not asking questions, or maybe there was an example set for you that's like, oh, maybe asking questions can be a good thing. Maybe it was TikTok.
Well, it was actually probably me, my best friend in college, who was my roommate for a year. He just loved questions and diving into like all the things you can debate about, like all the things I hated talking about, like predestination or like creation theories and all these things. He would just randomly try to get into these conversations with me, and I was always kind of like, I don't know if I want to talk about that. But eventually, like, I realized these conversations are kind of fun. And so we would talk all the time about those things, and even past being roommates, we would get together and just talk about random questions that he had, that I had. And eventually that just gave me a love for diving into, what is truth? How do we explore truth and explore these questions that I used to be afraid of? Yeah. So that's a little bit about me, but let's hear about you. So what has your faith journey or deconstruction, if you call it that, been up until now?
Where it really started for me, from a very young age, I was brought up in the Christian evangelical sphere. My family was non-denominational for a while, and eventually, much later in my story, we settled into the Wesleyan faith. And I've kind of veered from that. I wouldn't really identify as a Wesleyan. I guess I want to try and avoid labels as best I can, but the one that I find I relate to the most, but is widely misunderstood, so I don't want to tie myself to it too much, but I will mention it. And that is this idea of like an agnostic Christian. And I'll get into what that means for me later. But I was brought up in that evangelical sphere, and there was this, of course, there's this expectation that the most important thing is your faith. And especially in evangelicalism, it's helping other people know Jesus so they don't burn in hell for an eternity. And that's something that's like built up to be the most important thing. And so there was evangelism, and eventually my family would even get involved in missions. And so I was an MK for a little while. And
what is an MPA?
So MK is a missionary kid.
And MK.
Yeah. My parents, they did like somewhat, it was this weird like format of long-term but short-term mission trips where they would go to different countries and do a film workshop for about a week. And they'd bring in troubled youth and they'd like help them to learn about their strengths and their value, and that they can learn skills and produce things. It was a really cool ministry. I never really got to partake in it too much. We never raised enough for my brother and I to ever go overseas on any of those. So we spent most of our time, like whenever my parents would go on a trip, we would stay with like our grandparents or aunt and uncle. But there was a lot of experiences I had in that, which I felt warranted this feeling of certainty towards Christianity and faith that I just kind of had assumed, because everybody around me in that environment was so certain and oftentimes would express absolute knowledge of God and God's existence and the things that we know about God. And they would also expect other people to within that same circle. So oftentimes, like, there's certain creeds or things that you're supposed to say as a Christian in certain environments that they'll have you do, where you express absolute knowledge of certainty. And that always kind of didn't settle well with me, because I always felt like I was lying a little bit whenever I'd say those things, because I really wasn't certain. But everyone around me was so certain. I was like, surely they have good reason to be. And so time in missions really kind of helped me feel even more confident that there is good reason to be certain. But it was up until the moment when I actually tried to evangelize and reach out to somebody that I really started to realize, like, it is very hypocritical of me to expect other people to consider my beliefs and reject their own beliefs and consider rejecting their own beliefs when I'm not even willing to do the same thing. I didn't even know if it was okay for me to do the same thing. And I've made a TikTok video on that, but I also realized how ill-equipped I was to help somebody go from, my heart was like towards atheists, people who either turned to atheism from a religious background or born into an atheist family and raised without religion. And what would that journey look like to go from there to the sort of Christian faith I had at the time? I had no idea. I didn't know what kind of hurdles someone would need to overcome. And so I, out of a desire to be able to help people overcome those hurdles, I made it my mission to discover and understand them on a deep level. But eventually, I realized that these were more than just hurdles for someone else to overcome to get to where I was. They were also hurdles that I needed to overcome, because I had never taken the opportunity to overcome these hurdles. But I would need to overcome them in order to justify where I was in my Christian faith. And so I learned a lot of things, like taking that in and trying to figure out, okay, is my Christian faith justified? And I learned that in a lot of ways, it really wasn't. I wasn't able to overcome enough hurdles to really get to that place of Christian faith that I had been raised and told that I had to have. One of the things that really hit me is this idea, and this is kind of like, I don't know how to explain this, but God very well might be infinite and perfect. I don't know that for certain, but he very well might be. But one thing I do know for almost certain is that my understanding is neither of those things. And so my understanding will never equal God. And the only way I could ever seek and pursue an infinite and perfect God is if I am constantly deconstructing and questioning my understanding. It threw the idea of God's identity and nature for a loop for me, and made me really wonder, like, even if Christianity has some semblance of truth to it, my interpretation and understanding of it might be wrong. There's like 40,000 different denominations of Christianity.
Yeah.
So that's right? Highly likely.
Yeah. Who could possibly be right? And everybody acts like they are so right. And what I think is interesting about your story is my younger self and the people around me would be like, see what happens when you ask questions, you lose your faith. And so one of my questions is, what was the response of the people around you as your faith started to change and as you started to really go on that journey? How did people treat that journey of yours?
Well, I mean, initially it wasn't anything super extreme. Like, I think the initial response to my wanting to dive into and understand atheists, I was very open about that with my parents, and they encouraged me before I really started considering other questions and ideas and stuff to really like base myself in Christian apologetics and theology. And so that's where my focus was initially. And of course, there was a lot of support for that. My parents would, they provided me with books on Christian apologetics, and they made it their mission to try and arm me against the lies of the enemy and arm me against.
So they wanted you to come with a biased perspective.
Oh, for sure. And they wanted it to be a really well-informed biased perspective and a very inspired by, like, there's a lot of different Christian apologists out there. And so I think my parents were really hoping that I would kind of be inspired by them. And in a way I was, but kind of look to them as moral authorities or intellectual authorities, and just kind of trust what they were saying. But
yeah,
one thing that eventually happened, so I did a lot of this diving into Christian apologetics, and I watched debates between atheists and Christians and all this manner of things. And I wasn't oftentimes super satisfied with the answers that the atheists were giving to the apologists. But then a weird thing happened where I really wasn't satisfied with the responses that the apologists were giving to the atheists. And that was strange for me. And I eventually started like reaching out to people like, there was one guy in particular who is a professor in Christian apologetics and mathematics. And I connected with him over Facebook, and he and I talked back and forth for a while about the cosmological argument and that particular apologetic space. And it's this whole idea for anyone listening that like there has to be a first cause, there has to be a beginning to everything, and that beginning and that first cause has to be an intelligent God, because there can't be an infinite regression of causes and all this kind of stuff. And so I started talking with him about that, and we were first talking about the responses and arguments that atheists tend to have towards the argument. But I wasn't satisfied just talking about those. So I started to form my own rebuttal to the cosmological argument. Maybe we can talk about that in a later podcast. And we don't want to get too deep into the weeds right now. But I started asking my own questions and forming my own argument. And he asked me, he was like, but we've already won. Like, we have these answers and responses for the common questions that atheists have. Why go out of our way to take it apart and refute our good argument, even more so than our opponents? And that was a question I really wasn't expecting him to ask me, but I had an answer right away. I said, Well, I'm not really interested in winning. I'm interested in who is the winner. I want the truth, and I don't care which side ends up being. So I'm willing to give my opponent every shot I can to be valid in their position, and instead of just aiming to invalidate them at every step.
And that definitely is more than most people give, when, especially in a debate setting, but even in just a discussion setting, when you're discussing a topic, it is rare to give the other side any kind of validity, because you want to be the winner, right? The goal is to win, instead of to explore, or like, as you were saying, to, who is the winner? What is the actual truth? Does this actually hold up? Instead, you're just trying to win an argument, which in debate, you can do without actually being right. You can win a debate without being right. And so I kind of feel your sentiment when it comes to apologetics, that I never really felt satisfied with a lot of apologetics either. And what's interesting is I didn't realize for a long time that those were supposed to be the answers, because I remember actually read part of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, because I was curious. I was like, what is their best argument? Because he's supposed to be the renowned guy. And what I found is he was attacking these ideas that I thought were just things to think about, rather than like the arguments for Christianity. And I was like, well, I mean, it doesn't disprove God, because it never proved God. But I never realized, then I eventually realized, oh, I guess Christians were using that to prove God. And I just was out of the loop, apparently.
It was, I remember reaching that same conclusion and being sorely disappointed. Like, these things, they don't really act as the proofs that we try to present them as. They really more have, they more act as an assurance of the possibility. And that's a pretty big difference. That's a difference between a hypothesis and a law. And I think that is why you and I find ourselves here doing this show. And because we have both learned that neither of us really has, in a lot of situations, and I won't speak for you too much, but I'm pretty sure that we've talked about it and agreed, but neither of us really has enough information to be absolutely certain of a single possibility when it comes to a lot of matters. And because of that, we want to explore like the different possibilities more. And one of the things, like, throughout my whole journey, there were three major things that I really learned and that stick with me. And that is, one, I know very little. When it comes to the amount of knowledge out there that there is to know, I don't know a ton of it. My scope on reality is very small comparatively. And then two, there's no way I could ever come to understand everything and to know everything. There is a limit to the capacity of my brain. And in a way, that's kind of relieving, because if I don't have to know everything, if I don't have to know certain information in order to be saved, I guess, in Christian terms, then that's kind of good news. It takes a lot of the stress off. And the third thing is, there's a lot of things that I think I know that I'm probably wrong about. There's a lot of faulty knowledge in my brain. And that's just because I'm an imperfect human living in an imperfect world. And so that also, as scary as it is initially, kind of brings a sense of peace, because being an imperfect human living in an imperfect world means that there's always probably going to be something I'm wrong about. And if there is a God, he or she probably knows that I'm going to be wrong about a lot of things. And so if they're a good God, they're probably going to have a lot of grace for that. And so long as I'm willing to be corrected and to seek correction, I feel like that's the most important and probably just the best I can do with what I have.
Yeah, but I think
a certain amount of freedom to be wrong. And that's really comforting for me.
Absolutely. I think there is a strange, I think it's strange to me the anxiety that comes with needing to have all the answers and being certain and holding the truth and thinking that you hold all of the truth. There's this strange anxiety that comes with that, people say things like, oh, but the truth should give you peace and the truth should set you free, right? But I never really felt very free when I had to be tied to this certainty. But like you were saying, when you break out of that and you start to see it's actually okay for me not to be certain. It's okay for me to not have all the answers and to question and have doubts, because doubt is really just being in search of truth. And so doubt can actually be a really healthy and good thing. Yeah. And with that comes peace and freedom that we were told shouldn't come with it.
And did you ever experience the kind of anxiety of like, there's this whole idea that we have this absolute knowledge, but did you ever experience anxiety expressing that and fear that you might misrepresent it to somebody and somehow ruin them or corrupt them?
Yeah, I probably did have that to some extent. Yeah, so I just most of the time didn't say much or give my opinions very much. It's only so recently that I'm starting to use my voice.
Yeah, when you start to really realize, like, or accept the fact that you and other people are likely wrong about a lot of things, and we're all speaking from a place of limited and possibly faulty knowledge, it gives you a little bit of grace for yourself. And there's this whole idea that is constantly like the boogeyman in the Christian's closet. And that's this idea of a false teacher. And
yeah,
that was a concept that really struck me odd. Like, if we all have limited understanding and somewhat faulty understanding of God, if anybody in that position is going on at any length teaching about God, they're probably going to get something wrong. But does that make them a false teacher? Does that make them the boogeyman in the closet that we all need to avoid and be afraid of? Or does it just make them human?
Right.
And I kind of really reflected on, like, what does it mean? What is a false teacher? And the realization, or rather what I came to, is this idea that because everybody is wrong to some capacity and can be wrong when they teach, if that was what it took for somebody to be a false teacher, then everyone would be a false teacher. But clearly, especially when it comes to like what the Bible says about false prophets and stuff, that's not everybody. So who is it then? And the best I can come up with is it's people who intentionally are deceptive. They don't actually speak what they believe. They speak what people want to hear. And they do it to manipulate and to twist and to force some kind of agenda. It's dishonesty. That's what a false teacher is. Whereas a good teacher is somebody who's speaking from a place of honesty about what they believe, but especially from a place of humility, recognizing that, hey, I could be wrong. And throughout this whole show, we're going to be speaking from a place of limited knowledge. So it's very likely that our listeners in the comments will be filling us in on all manner of things. We're going to learn a lot, and I'm super excited about that. What is your take on the whole concept of false teachers and false prophets, and how did you navigate those waters when you came to a place of questioning? And I imagine maybe it never did cross your mind, but did it cross your mind that, oh man, I got to be careful that I'm not too vocal because I don't want to be a false teacher and lead people into damnation?
I think it was less for me about what I was taking in, or less of, I guess, what I was giving out, like as far as what I was saying, because I pretty much was confident in what I believed, at least. As I started to talk about these things, and it wasn't this kind of confidence as in like I am 100% certain that I'm right, but it like I think I naturally gave myself some grace on that it's okay to be wrong. Like I eventually later in life had some very important people in my life who reassured that like it's okay to be wrong, and so like I held on to that But it was more this fear of like, who am I listening to? Am I listening to false teachers, and are they convincing me? And there was that kind of anxiety because everybody's a false teacher who doesn't agree with your very specific church. I don't even want to say denomination, because most of the time it's just one church. Denominations can't even agree among themselves.
Right.
But yeah, so I did have that anxiety. And now my view on it is basically kind of what you said. Somebody who intentionally deceives and leads people into lies, into things that I would say are harmful, pushing their agenda either to gain power, money, whatever it may be. And they either know that they're doing it, or they have convinced themselves that it's good. And maybe they have done so in a way that they don't even know the extent of what they're doing. That still would make them a false teacher. Not just somebody who gets things wrong, because everybody gets things wrong. Every teacher still has to learn, but somebody who's intentionally leading people into harm.
Yeah. Something that struck me this morning. We are a show that's aiming to explore all of the possibilities, or at least as many possibilities as have come to mind and we have time for many different topics. And we're aiming to go out of our way to some extent to try and view each possibility in as valid of a light as we can, like even beyond whatever arguments the people who take that position might have, maybe even presenting our own arguments or our own possibilities to those situations. But that sounds very similar to another genre of content, namely conspiracy theories. So how do we avoid becoming a conspiracy theory show? Do we even avoid that?
Well, I think we will probably explore conspiracy theories, because I think that would be some really interesting conversation.
Oh, for sure.
I think the difference between us and conspiracy theorists is, knowing you and I both, we are more geared towards tangible evidence that we can look at and observe, and conspiracy theorists aren't as much concerned with that. And at the same time, conspiracy theorists also have quite a bit of confidence without evidence of things that I don't think either of us have, because we don't even have confidence on things we do have evidence for sometimes. So it's going to be a thing where we are hopefully not pushing listeners to believe a certain thing of our perspective, whatever that means, but just exploring what could be. And there will probably be things that we are biased about, that we're like, it really probably isn't that, but we should probably talk about it still.
It'll be the difference between conspiracy theorists saying this is the reality and us saying this is a possible but highly unlikely, not very supported possibility.
Right. So one thing that I think is important for our listeners to know is, especially talking about our background, and we brought up the Bible a few times, is this a Christian podcast, or what is it going to be?
Yeah, I think that we're probably going to spend a bit of time kind of unpacking religion and Christianity. We'll probably start with a lot of those sort of topics and circle back around to them in the future. However, we explicitly aimed and desire for this show to be able to branch out into other things, be it the mysteries of the universe and science, which we don't know, admittedly, or at least I don't know, admittedly, a ton about, but we'll do a little bit of research and not state anything with absolute certainty, but just explore what scientists are pondering and what theories are at odds, and the possibility of all of them. And then maybe even diving into a little bit of ethics here and there. Are there any other topics that you think we might dive into, Micah?
I think ethics is probably something that I'm very interested in. And I think we will talk about throughout the many topics is bringing up, well, what is the ethics involved in this? I know that you kind of identified but don't like the title, which I agree. I hate looking at titles and even giving myself a label, which I struggle to even right now think of what I would tell people, except that at the moment, which I am open to change because I am still exploring faith and religion and all of these things.
For sure.
But I wouldn't consider myself Christian at the moment. And so that's going to offer some different perspectives as we dive into these as well.
Yeah. Yeah. To kind of expand, because I mentioned that I would a little bit on what I mean by agnostic Christian. Essentially, I don't claim to have absolute knowledge or certainty towards anything Christian, like towards what the Bible says or any of the things in it, or towards the existence of God or any of the claims for his nature. The only reason I include Christian in my title is because there are certain things, certain aspects and facets of Christianity that I would prefer if they were true, even if, and it's hard to say that because there's so many different takes on Christianity. So to be more clear, there are certain things about Christianity through the way I specifically interpret it that I kind of hope are true. But there's other ways that it's interpreted that I really, really hope are not true.
Right.
And I don't have any of that, any knowledge, and I don't even claim for Christianity and the existence of God to be a theory, because I don't think I have enough evidence to make that statement. It's more of a favorable hypothesis of mine. So the uncertainty parts regarding all of it encapsulates my agnosticism, but my hope towards it, which from a Christian standpoint, faith is confidence in what we hope for. It's not certainty in what we know. It is just favoring a hypothesis. That is faith. And so I guess you could say I kind of have faith towards it. However, I recognize that I can hope for more than one thing. If I am not certain of any one thing, I can hope for multiple things. So I have intentions, and perhaps even we'll explore in this show, to dive into other worldviews and other religious worldviews and ponder the possibility of those and see if I can find something worth hoping for from any of those sources. And then even whether or not there's something worth hoping for from an atheist worldview. So that's kind of my explanation of I am tentatively an agnostic Christian, in that Christianity is so far the gist of what I know in terms of religious knowledge. And so I relate to it the most, but it might change. And it's likely to change.
Definitely. I think it's important for us to kind of throw that out there, because especially people hearing at the beginning, like, oh, we both have been Christians and grew up Christian, just to know that we are not limiting our conversations to things that are Christians, or even trying to push some kind of like Christian belief on anyone.
Oh,
if
for
anything,
sure.
We're not trying to push anything on anyone. We're just really,
that is the goal.
doing what we say in the title, is pondering in the morning and talking about different topics and exploring your questions and learning from each other. And I think it's going to be important to hear from those who tune in what questions you have and what questions are going to prompt us to think about things in a different way. And if we misrepresent something, that hopefully we get called out for it, because I guarantee we're going to do it.
Yeah, I want to reemphasize, because I think it's super important for us to express that we're going to be approaching just about anything from a very limited scope, from very limited knowledge. We'll probably do some diving in and some research, be it surface level or something more in depth, but we are not coming to our listeners claiming that, we are the authorities in knowledge and information, and you guys are privileged to listen and learn from us. No, we really look forward to looking into what you guys think might be possible and the reasons you might have for your positions and learning from that. And we'll probably talk about what we learn from the comments in future videos.
So I guess maybe the next thing is, where can people find us? Where can people connect with us? Where are these podcasts going to be, and when will they be?
Of course. So we're going to be releasing a video format of this podcast to YouTube and other listening services such as Spotify and the podcast app every Wednesday. We're also going to be creating a TikTok channel where we'll post highlights, clips of our conversations. And if you want to find Micah and I on TikTok, you can find Micah at Pondering Together with no spaces. And you can find me at Truth Voyager. Yeah. Anything else you'd like to mention?
I don't think so. I think that does it for this episode.
All right. You guys have a wonderful morning.